Tehran, October 1977. The sun is setting behind the Alborz Mountains, turning the snow-capped peaks a deep, burning amber, the kind of color that makes you stop walking and just stare. Down below, in the city, the streets are alive. A woman in a white miniskirt and oversized sunglasses walks past a cinema marquee advertising the latest film from Hollywood. She is laughing at something her friend said. She does not cover her hair. She does not look over her shoulder. She has no reason to. From a bar 2 doors down, jazz spills out onto the sidewalk, an Iranian trumpet player running through a Miles Davis riff with the kind of loose confidence that only comes from years of practice. The smell of saffron rice drifts from a restaurant next door, mixing with cigarette smoke, and the faint diesel exhaust of a city that never quite stops moving. A group of university students sit on the steps of a bookstore, arguing about Sartre, not quietly, loudly, the way young people argue when they believe the future belongs to them. This is Tehran at its peak. This is Iran as it was.
With great pleasure
not
that
the
I
Iran
the
of today,
will
veiled,
sanctioned,
isolated.
The land
It's
is
people
finally
protesting
ours.
in the streets for the right to simply exist as they choose. Not the Iran of ayatollahs and morality police and mandatory dress codes enforced at gunpoint. This is a different country entirely. A country where women served as judges and senators, where the National Orchestra performed Beethoven to sold-out crowds, where the Hilton and the Intercontinental competed for guests, and where the Shiraz Arts Festival drew the greatest avant-garde artists on earth to perform in the ruins of ancient Persepolis. This is the Iran that existed before the revolution, and it was real. Here is what haunts the millions of Iranians who lived it, who fled it, who carry
Welcome to the
photographs
city,
of it
Mr.
in their
Ambassador.
wallets 45
It
years
is a pleasure
later.
to be here.
It did not
We are
disappear
delighted to have
gradually.
you.
It did not fade. It was not slowly eroded by time, or neglect, or poverty. This world, this specific, breathing, laughing, arguing, music-playing world, was dismantled in a single year. In the space of roughly 12 months, between the winter of 1978 and the spring of 1979, an entire civilization was erased, not conquered by a foreign army, not destroyed by a natural disaster, overthrown by its own people, replaced by something so different that the before and after feel like 2 separate countries that happen to share a map. This is the story of what Iran was before the revolution, not as nostalgia, not as propaganda, as a reckoning with what was built, what was broken, and what was lost in the burning. That woman in the white miniskirt, 2 years later, she would be legally required to veil or face imprisonment. The jazz bar,
So if
shuttered.
we examine the
Alcohol
underlying
banned by
structures,
decree.
the inherent
students arguing about
contradictions become
Sartre,
apparent,
some of them would
leading
be
us-
executed,
explains
others would
everything.
board planes and never come back.
catch us
The mountains still glow amber at sunset over Tehran. They always will. But everything below them changed forever. This is the story of how. To understand what Iran was before the revolution, you first have to understand the man who built it and the fatal arrogance embedded in everything he touched. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi did not inherit a modern country.
It's a
He
pleasure
inherited
doing
a
business
feudal
with you,
one.
gentlemen.
When his
Indeed.
father, Reza
To our
Shah,
mutual
seized
success.
power in 1925, Iran was a patchwork of tribal territories
arrows
and
indicate their
dirt-poor
main
villages.
advance. We
Its
must
oil
secure this
being
position
extracted
by
by the
nightfall.
British,
But what
while
about the
most
southern
Iranians
flank?
lived without
We risk
electricity,
encirclement if we
without
commit fully.
schools, without basic sanitation. The elder Shah had begun dragging the country into the 20th century through sheer authoritarian force, banning the veil, building roads, establishing a national army, sending students to Europe. His son intended to finish the job. By 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah announced what he called the White Revolution, a sweeping series of reforms designed to transform Iran from within. Land was redistributed from feudal landlords to peasants. A literacy corps was created, sending educated young Iranians into rural villages to teach reading and writing. Forests and pasture lands were nationalized. Profit-sharing programs were introduced in factories. And in a move that shocked the traditional clergy almost beyond words, women were given the right to vote. This was not a timid government. This was a government in a hurry. But here is where the Shah's fatal contradiction begins to reveal itself. He wanted a modern country. He wanted the trappings of a 20th century nation-state, the universities, the industries, the international prestige, the gleaming capital city. What he did not want and would not allow was the political infrastructure that modern nations require. No genuine opposition party, no free press, no independent judiciary, no mechanism by which ordinary Iranians could register dissent without risking their freedom or their lives. You could wear a miniskirt in Tehran, you could not criticize the king. This is the central paradox that runs like a fault line beneath everything that follows. The Shah modernized the surface of Iran while calcifying its political core. He built universities that produced an educated class and then gave that educated class no legitimate outlet for their ambitions or their grievances. He created a middle class sophisticated enough to read Camus and debate Marxism, and then deployed a secret police force to monitor their conversations. That secret police force was called Savak. And in 1977,
I still can't believe we
Tehran,
finally have it.
everyone knew its name.
I know, it's perfect.
Savak, the
Let's take her down to the
Organization of
coast.
National Security and Intelligence, was established in 1957 with direct assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Its official mandate was to protect the Shah from communist infiltration and foreign subversion. Its actual function was considerably broader. Savak monitored universities, infiltrated political organizations, censored newspapers, and made certain that anyone who spoke too loudly against the regime understood the consequences. Those consequences included arrest, imprisonment, and according to accounts that would emerge after the revolution, torture in the basement cells of Evin Prison. The name Evin Prison did not need explanation in Tehran. People spoke it quietly. And yet, and this is what makes the story so complicated, so irreducible to simple heroes and villains, the Iran that Savak protected was also genuinely building something. The oil money was real. The growth was real. The hospitals and highways and schools were real. Between 1963 and 1977, Iran's GDP grew at rates that rivaled South Korea and Taiwan. Literacy rates climbed from below 30% to above 50%. Life expectancy rose by nearly a decade. Tehran, a city of roughly 2 million people in 1960, swelled to over 4 million by the mid-1970s, with skyline sprouting cranes like a body growing new limbs. The 1973 oil shock, when OPEC's embargo sent oil prices through the roof, turned an already fast-growing economy into something that felt almost surreal. Iran's oil revenues quadrupled almost overnight. The Shah announced plans to make Iran one of the world's 5 great industrial powers by the year 2000. He was not speaking metaphorically. He genuinely believed it. He ordered nuclear power plants, a subway system for Tehran, massive steelworks, petrochemical complexes, all of it simultaneously, all of it urgently, all of it funded by oil money flowing in faster than any government could responsibly spend it. But the flood of petrodollars did not flow evenly. It pooled at the top. The urban professional class engineers, doctors, lawyers, architects saw their standard of living rise dramatically. The industrial workers in Tehran's factories benefited in measurable ways, but the tens of thousands of rural Iranians flooding into the cities every year, driven off their land by the Shah's own agricultural reforms and pulled by the promise of factory jobs, often found themselves in overcrowded shantytowns on the edges of Tehran, neither wealthy enough to participate in the boom, nor rooted enough in the city to build stable lives. They had left their villages. They had not yet found their place. These displaced Iranians, caught between the world they had left and the world they could not fully enter, would become the human fuel of the revolution. But in 1973, 1974, 1975, that was not yet obvious. What was obvious was that Iran was being transformed at a speed that had no historical precedent in the region. And at the center of that transformation, making every major decision, tolerating no challenge to his authority, convinced that he alone understood Iran's destiny, was a man who was also quietly dying. Mohammad Reza Shah had been diagnosed with lymphoma in the early 1970s. Only a handful of people in the world knew. He governed through the boom years of the mid-1970s, with the knowledge of his own mortality, pressing against everything he did, making him more reckless, perhaps, or more grandiose, or simply more desperate to see his vision completed before time ran out. The country he was building was, in some sense, a monument he was racing to finish. The tragedy is that he nearly succeeded, and the tragedy within the tragedy is that his methods guaranteed his failure. You cannot build an educated, urbanized, politically aware population and then expect them to stay silent. You cannot create a generation of women who attend university, practice law, and read feminist theory and then expect them to accept that their lives are the Shah's to design. You cannot build a country and then tell the country it has no voice. The Shah built a pressure cooker. He kept the lid on by force. But pressure, ignored long enough, does not dissipate. It explodes. In 1977, standing in the gleaming capital he had built, surrounded by the oil wealth he had channeled, he could not yet hear the hissing. Before we watch it all come apart, we have to live in it for a moment. We have to understand what was actually there, what the streets felt like, what the culture produced, what ordinary life looked like for the people who inhabited it, because only then does the loss mean anything. Tehran, in the mid-1970s, was a city that defied every assumption a Western audience might carry about the Middle East. It was not a desert city of minarets and covered women. It was a sprawling, complicated, rapidly modernizing metropolis of 4 million people that felt, in its wealthier districts, more like a European capital than anything in the Arab world. Valley Asser Street, still, the longest boulevard in the Middle East, was lined with plane trees imported from France, their branches arching over the sidewalk in a canopy that turned the avenue into a kind of urban cathedral. On either side of it, bookstores, boutiques, patisseries, cinemas, restaurants, and coffee shops where you could spend an afternoon arguing about politics or poetry without anyone bothering you. The cinemas mattered, not just as entertainment, as cultural markers. In 1977, Tehran had more than 300 cinemas. They showed everything: American westerns, French New Wave films, Italian neorealism, and increasingly, the work of Iranian directors who were developing one of the most distinctive national cinemas on earth. Dariush Merjoui, Abbas Kiarostami, Bahram Beyzai, these were filmmakers doing serious, internationally recognized work. Kiarostami had already made several short films for the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, and the sensibility he was developing, spare, humanistic, deeply attentive to ordinary Iranian life, would eventually make him one of the most celebrated directors in world cinema. In 1977, he was simply a young Iranian filmmaker working in a country that took its arts seriously. The Rudaki Hall, Tehran's grand opera house, named after the 10th-century Persian poet, hosted the Tehran Symphony Orchestra, which performed to sold-out audiences of men and women seated together in Western formal dress, listening to Mahler and Brahms and Shostakovich. The Tehran Philharmonic gave regular concerts. Western classical music had been woven into the fabric of Iranian elite culture for decades. Queen Farah herself was a genuine patron, not in the ceremonial sense, but in the active, engaged sense of someone who cared deeply about what art meant and what it could do. Which brings us to the Shiraz Arts Festival. If there is a single institution that captures the ambition and the particular character of cultural Iran in the 1970s, it is the Shiraz Arts Festival, held annually from 1967 to 1977 at the ancient ruins of Persepolis. This was not a regional folk festival. This was not a government showcase of approved nationalist art. This was one of the most adventurous international arts festivals on earth, drawing performers and artists who were changing the nature of their fields. Karlheinz Stockhausen performed electronic compositions under the Persian stars. Peter Brook brought experimental theater. Robert Wilson staged avant-garde pieces that would have been controversial in New York, let alone in a country that many Westerners still associated with bazaars and camels. Iranian artists performed alongside them, in a genuine exchange rather than a tourist display. For 10 days a year, the ruins of the Achaemenid Empire, the same stones where Cyrus the Great had built the first declaration of human rights, became one of the most culturally alive places on the planet. This is what people mean when they say what was lost. Not just freedom in the abstract. This, specifically. And then there were the women. If the Shiraz Festival represents what the Shah's Iran could produce at its most ambitious, the lives of Iranian women in the 1970s represent what it could offer at the most personal level and what the revolution would take at the most personal level. The Family Protection Law of 1967, expanded in 1975, fundamentally altered the legal position of women in Iranian society. For the first time, women could initiate divorce proceedings. child custody was no longer automatically awarded to the father. The minimum age for marriage was raised to 15. Then 18. Polygamy was restricted. Women could obtain passports without their husband's permission. These were not small changes. In a country where Islamic family law had governed private life for over 1,000 years, these reforms were seismic, and they were matched by changes in public life that were equally transformative. By the mid-1970s, women made up nearly 40% of university students. There were women in parliament, not token presences, but active legislators. There were women judges, women serving in the military, women practicing medicine, law, and engineering in numbers that would not be matched again until decades after the revolution. Consider the daily life of a young woman, call her Mariam, though she stands for thousands studying law at the University of Tehran in 1975. She wakes up in her dormitory room, shared with another student, a woman from Isfahan studying engineering. She dresses without consideration of religious obligation, jeans perhaps, or a dress, her hair loose. She attends lectures given by both male and female professors. She eats lunch in a mixed cafeteria, arguing with a male classmate about a constitutional law case. In the evening, she might go to a cinema with friends, or to a party at someone's apartment where wine is served and a record player fills the room with the voice of Gugush, Iran's beloved pop star, a woman who performed in glittering stage costumes to audiences of millions. Mariam does not think of her life as remarkable. It is simply her life. She is training to become a lawyer. She has a future in which she will use that training. That future feels solid. It feels real. Within 4 years of that evening, everything she takes for granted will be illegal. But in 1975, the cracks in this world are not visible from inside it. They are visible only in retrospect, only to those who know what is coming. The inflation that began eating into middle-class savings in 1975 and 1976, as the Shah's spending outpaced even the oil windfall. The young men pouring into Tehran from the provinces, finding the factory jobs had not materialized, living 10 to a room in neighborhoods where the new wealth was a rumor rather than a reality. The cassette tapes circulating in the tea houses of South Tehran, recordings of a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, speaking from exile in Iraq in a voice that was low and certain and utterly without concession, telling his listeners that everything the Shah had built was a betrayal of Islam and a capitulation to foreign masters. Most Iranians in 1975 had never heard of Khomeini. Most of those who had dismissed him as a fringe figure, a relic. The Shah's security apparatus monitored his network, arrested his supporters when it could find them, but did not take him seriously as a political threat. He was in exile. He had no army. He had no party. He had only his voice, reproduced on cheap magnetic tape, passed from hand to hand across a country that was, without anyone fully realizing it, beginning to turn. One evening in 1977, a family sits together in their Tehran apartment. The father, a mid-level government engineer, watches the evening news on the state television, carefully controlled, officially optimistic, broadcasting images of the Shah cutting ribbons at new factories. His daughter, 19 years old and preparing for her university entrance exams, sits at the table doing homework. His wife is in the kitchen. The smell of gourmet sabzi fills the apartment. They are not a political family. They do not discuss Savak. They do not discuss Khomeini. They discuss whether their daughter should study medicine or engineering. They discuss a cousin's wedding. They discuss whether the new apartment building down the street has better construction than the one next to it. They are living in the last chapter of their world. They do not know it yet. Outside the window, Tehran hums and blazes, 4 million lives in motion, a city that is simultaneously ancient and brand new, terrible and beautiful, built on oil, money, and royal ambition, and the labor of people who came from every corner of a vast country in search of something better. The mountains glow amber behind it all. The jazz bar is still open. The miniskirts are still visible on the street. The students are still arguing on the bookstore steps. Everything is exactly as it should be. It will not be for much longer. The world does not end with an explosion. Not at first. It ends with a newspaper article, then a letter, then a funeral, then another funeral. The unraveling of pre-revolutionary Iran did not announce itself. It crept in through the margins, a policy loosened here, a protest suppressed there, a body in the street that everyone saw and no one was allowed to discuss. And then it became something no one could stop. Phase 1. The first tremors, 1977. In the summer of 1977, something unexpected happened. Jimmy Carter, newly elected as President of the United States, began making noise about human rights as a cornerstone of American foreign policy. Iran was one of America's closest allies. The Shah received American weapons, American military advisors, and American political protection in exchange for oil stability and a bulwark against Soviet influence in the region. But Carter's rhetoric created an unusual pressure. The Shah, sensitive to his international image and eager to maintain American support, made a calculation. He would loosen the reins. Slightly, temporarily, just enough to demonstrate to Washington that Iran was a modern, humane state. It was one of the most consequential miscalculations in modern political history. Within months of the Shah's slight relaxation of censorship, Iranian intellectuals began to do what Iranian intellectuals had been doing in private for years: writing, speaking, organizing. A series of open letters, signed by lawyers and writers and academics, appeared publicly, calling for respect for the rule of law, the release of political prisoners, and an end to censorship. 10 Nights of Poetry, an event held at the Goethe Institute in Tehran in October 1977, drew enormous crowds night after night to hear poets read work that pushed against every boundary the Shah had set. The audiences were not a revolutionary mob. They were teachers, students, doctors, professionals, the exact people the Shah's modernization had produced. They were exhilarated. They had never been allowed to gather like this before. They had never been allowed to say these things publicly. For 10 evenings, something extraordinary was briefly possible in Tehran. But Savak was watching, and the Shah, alarmed by the scale of what he'd unleashed, began tightening again almost immediately. In August 1978, a fire broke out at the Cinema Rex in the southwestern city of Abadan. The doors had been locked from the outside. 422 people burned to death inside. 422. The opposition immediately blamed Savak. The locked doors, they argued, were deliberate. The government blamed Islamic extremists who opposed cinema as Western decadence. The truth would remain disputed for years. But in the streets of Iran, in the mosques and the bazaars and the tea houses, the story that spread was the government's story told in reverse. The Shah's people had done this. The Shah's people had murdered 400 Iranians in a locked building because they went to the movies. Whether it was true or not, it no longer mattered. The street had already decided. Phase 2. The mosques mobilize. Early 1978. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about the architecture of Iranian society that the Shah had failed to fully grasp: the mosque network. Savak had infiltrated political parties, shut down newspapers, monitored universities, and arrested or intimidated anyone who formed an independent political organization. What Savak could not do, what no Iranian government had ever successfully done, was fully control the mosques. Mosques were everywhere. Every neighborhood, every village, every town had one. The clergy who led them were trusted in ways that no government institution was trusted. And crucially, they communicated through a network that predated telephones, predated printing presses, predated any modern communication infrastructure: the informal, person-to-person network of religious observance that had been functioning continuously for over 1,000 years. Khomeini, still in exile now in Paris after being expelled from Iraq at the Shah's request, understood this network in a way no one in the Shah's government did. He had spent decades building relationships within it, and beginning in late 1977, he began using it with extraordinary discipline. The instrument was the 40-day mourning cycle. In Shia Islam, the dead are mourned for 40 days after their passing, then again at the anniversary. Each time, protesters were killed, and the Shah's security forces were killing protesters with increasing frequency. Their deaths triggered a 40-day mourning observance. That mourning observance became a protest. At that protest, more people were killed. Their deaths triggered another 40-day observance. Another protest, more deaths. It was a self-perpetuating engine of mobilization, built into the very structure of religious practice, and the Shah had no answer for it. Who was in the streets? This is where the story becomes genuinely complicated and genuinely important. It was not only the religious poor. It was not only the conservative villagers who had moved to Tehran and found themselves alienated from both worlds. In the streets of Tehran in 1978, you could find university students carrying Marxist pamphlets, marching next to bazaar merchants carrying Qurans, alongside secular intellectuals and religious women, and leftist guerrillas and middle-class professionals who had never attended a political meeting in their lives. They shared almost nothing in terms of vision, in terms of what they wanted Iran to become. But they shared one thing, a hatred of the Shah that had been building for years, under the surface, invisible to him, because he had made it invisible. The Shah looked at his country and saw the highways and the factories and the universities. He did not see the pressure. He could not. He had made sure of it. Then came Black Friday. September 8, 3/2020. Martial law had been declared in Tehran and 11 other cities the previous day, banning all public gatherings. But the news had not fully spread, or had not been believed, or had simply been ignored by people who were past the point of being deterred by government orders. In Jaleh Square in Tehran, a crowd gathered. Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands. The army opened fire. The official death toll was 84. Opposition groups claimed hundreds. The true number has never been definitively established, but the number, whatever it was not the point. The point was that the Shah's army had opened fire on Iranian civilians in an Iranian city square on an ordinary Friday morning, and the entire country knew it. There was no coming back from that. There was no speech the Shah could give, no reform he could announce, no gesture of reconciliation that could undo Jaleh Square. The revolution, which had been a possibility, a rumble, a gathering storm, became, after the 8th of September 1978, an inevitability. The only question was what shape it would take. Phase 3. The elite begin to leave. Late 1978. The first sign that a society is truly falling apart is not violence. It is departure. In October 1978, Iranian banks began reporting unusual outflows of capital. The amounts were staggering billions of dollars, moved quietly out of Iranian accounts and into Swiss banks, American banks, British banks. The people moving this money were not the rural poor. They were the industrialists, the landowners, the senior government officials, the businessmen who had profited most from the Shah's boom years. They were looking at what was happening in the streets and doing a very simple calculation. If this ends badly, I want my money somewhere safe. Their money left first. Then, gradually, they followed it. The Hilton began to empty. Not of tourists, there were always fewer of those now, as travel advisories multiplied, but of the Iranian businessmen who had been its regulars, who had held their meetings in its lobby and their dinner parties in its restaurant for years. The Intercontinental reported similar patterns. The nightclubs that had defined Tehran's social life for a decade began closing, one by one, not because they were ordered to, not yet, but because the customers stopped coming. The streets of North Tehran, where the wealthiest Iranians lived in villas behind high walls, grew quieter. The woman from the university, Mariam, studying for her law degree, planning her future with the solid confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that a future exists, began noticing things. Classmates who stopped coming to lectures, professors who showed up distracted, went through the motions, and then, one day, simply were not there anymore. A friend's family had left for London. Another friend's father had been arrested. Another friend, a young man who had always seemed completely apolitical, had apparently joined one of the guerrilla organizations and gone underground. She did not join anyone. She kept going to class. She told herself it would settle down. The Shah, meanwhile, was governing like a ghost. His lymphoma was advancing. The treatments left him exhausted and disoriented. The advisors around him gave contradictory advice, some urging brutal crackdown, others urging dramatic liberalization, no one with a clear picture of how far things had already gone. He appeared on national television periodically, his face puffy, his manner strangely passive for a man who had ruled with absolute authority for 25 years. He announced reforms that came too late. He appointed prime ministers who had no real power. He seemed to be watching events from a distance, as though they were happening to someone else. The city around him was transforming in ways he could not control and could not reverse. Women who had never veiled in their lives began wearing headscarves when they went out, not from religious conviction, but from a rational assessment of where things were heading. Better to be inconspicuous. Better to not be identified as someone who belonged to the old world. The climate of the streets had shifted in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to miss. The exhilaration of the protests had an edge to it now, a hardness that was not entirely comfortable if you were associated with what was being protested against. December 1978. The month of Muharram, the holiest period in the Shia calendar, the commemoration of the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala in 680 AD, Khomeini called for maximum demonstrations. On Tasu'a and Ashura, the 9th and 10th days of Muharram, an estimated 6 to 9 million Iranians took to the streets across the country, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions. In Tehran alone, the crowd stretched for miles in every direction, a human ocean that the Shah's army, whatever its orders, could not possibly have fired upon without triggering a massacre of historic proportions. The army did not fire. The army stood and watched. Some soldiers wept, some removed their insignia, some simply walked away. It was over. Not officially, not yet, but the army that had been the ultimate guarantee of the Shah's power had looked at what stood against it and flinched. When an authoritarian state loses its army, it loses everything. The rest is just paperwork. Phase 4. The King Flees. January 1979. The 16th of January 1979. Early morning. Mehrabad Airport, Tehran. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, Emperor of Iran, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, boarded a plane. He was accompanied by his wife, Empress Farah, and a small entourage. He carried a small container of Iranian soil in his hand, a gesture, either sentimental or theatrical, that he had planned in advance. He told the Prime Minister he was leaving for a rest and vacation. He told almost no one else anything at all. He never came back. The news spread through Tehran within hours. And then something happened that the Shah's advisors, even those who had predicted his departure, had not fully anticipated. The city erupted in joy. Not nervous relief, not cautious optimism, pure, unrestrained, street-flooding joy. Iranians poured out of their homes and apartments and ran toward the nearest crowd. Cars honked continuously. Strangers embraced. People climbed onto lampposts and rooftops. Someone spray-painted "The Shah is gone" on the wall of the American embassy. Statues of the Shah that had stood in public squares for decades were torn down with a fury that suggested how long the impulse to tear them down had been suppressed. But even in the midst of the celebration, something was already being lost. The Tehran that had danced the Tehran of the jazz bars and the mini-skirts and the open-air cinema was gone before the revolution had even formally concluded. It had been disappearing for months, piece by piece, venue by venue, departure by departure. The celebration in the streets was real, but what came next would not be a liberation for everyone. On the 1st of February 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's Air France flight from Paris landed at Mehrabad Airport. 5 million people lined the route from the airport to the city. 5 million. When a reporter on the plane asked him what he felt about returning to Iran after 15 years in exile, Khomeini said, "Nothing." The old world didn't end with a battle, it ended with a crowd. Phase 5. The Erasure. Spring-Summer 1979. What happened next was not inevitable. Or rather, it was not inevitable from the beginning. It became inevitable through a series of choices made by specific people in specific moments, choices that foreclosed other possibilities and narrowed the future to a single path. The revolution had been made by a coalition. Islamists and Marxists and secular nationalists and religious moderates and feminist organizations and student unions and labor movements and the professional middle class, all united by opposition to the Shah, divided on almost everything else. In the weeks after the Shah's departure, that coalition still existed. It was tense, it was internally contradictory, but it was real. People who had very different visions for Iran's future had fought together to end one chapter, and the next chapter had not yet been written. Khomeini wrote it, quickly, ruthlessly, with a clarity of purpose that none of his coalition partners could match. The first executions came within weeks. Former members of SAVAK, former generals, former prime ministers. The revolutionary tribunals moved at a speed that made due process impossible. The accused were brought before judges, charged, condemned, and executed in proceedings that sometimes lasted minutes. The left, which had helped make the revolution, watched this with unease but told itself that the excesses were temporary, that the Islamic Republic would develop into something more pluralistic, that Khomeini was a symbol rather than a permanent ruler. They were wrong. They would discover how wrong in ways that destroyed them. In April 1979, Khomeini announced that compulsory hijab, mandatory veiling for all women in public, would be implemented immediately. The announcement came without warning, without consultation, without any of the legislative process that the new constitution supposedly guaranteed. Women who had marched in the revolutionary demonstrations, who had chanted alongside the men, who had believed they were fighting for a freer Iran, were told in April 1979 that their bodies were now the property of the Islamic State. On the 8th of March 1979, International Women's Day, tens of thousands of Iranian women had already taken to the streets to protest the hijab decree. They were met with attacks from groups of men. They chanted, "We did not make the revolution to go backwards." The revolution heard them, and went backwards anyway. What followed across 1979 was not a transition. It was a systematic dismantling. The Family Protection Law was repealed, the law that had given women the right to divorce, that had raised the marriage age, that had restricted polygamy gone, by decree, within months. Women judges were removed from their positions. They were told that Islamic law did not permit women to serve as judges. The minimum marriage age was lowered to 9 years old. The testimony of a woman in court was assigned half the legal weight of a man's testimony. The Shiraz Arts Festival was cancelled. It would never be held again. The Tehran Symphony Orchestra was disbanded. Classical music was deemed insufficiently Islamic. The Rudaki Hall fell silent. Wine was banned. Every establishment that served alcohol was closed. The bars that had lined Tehran's streets, where people had sat on warm evenings with a glass and an argument and a view of the mountains gone, their signs taken down, their interiors stripped, their licenses revoked, their owners arrested or fled. The cinemas, those 300 cinemas that had shown everything from Bergman to Kiarostami, many of them burned in the months of upheaval, or closed by decree, or transformed into mosques or community centers. The Cinema Rex in Abadan, where 400 people had died in the fire the previous year, became a symbol of everything the revolution claimed to oppose. But the revolution that claimed to oppose it would shut more cinemas than the Shah's government ever had. Maryam, the law student, her future as a judge was no longer legally possible. Her presence in public without a headscarf was now a criminal offense. The law degree she was completing had been reshaped around her. The new curriculum would be reorganized according to Islamic jurisprudence, and the women's dormitory where she lived would be segregated in ways it never had been before. The casually mixed world of the university she had inhabited, the cafeteria arguments, the study sessions, the lectures where she had sat beside male classmates without a second thought, was being divided, compartmentalized, restricted. She was 20 years old. She had never thought of herself as living in a golden age, but golden ages are only visible in retrospect, from the far side of their ending. The jazz bar on the corner? A religious center now. The Hollywood cinema marquee? Taken down. The woman in the white miniskirt who walked past it, laughing? She is either veiled or she is gone on a plane to Los Angeles or Paris or London, carrying photographs in her luggage that she will take out sometimes, in quiet moments, and look at for a long time. The mountains still glow amber. They always will. Everything below them has changed forever. History has a way of measuring its catastrophes in numbers. In revolutions, the numbers that matter most are not always the ones counted immediately, the executed, the imprisoned, the displaced in the first months. Sometimes, the numbers that matter most only become visible across years, as the full shape of what has been lost comes into focus. Between 1979 and 1985, somewhere between 2 and 4 million Iranians left their country. The estimates vary because no one was counting carefully in the chaos of those years, and because many of those who left did not believe, at first, that they were leaving permanently. They took their savings, and their children, and their degrees, and they went to the airports, and they told themselves it was temporary, that things would settle, that they would return when the situation clarified. Most of them never came back. What this represented, in human terms, was the largest single brain drain in the history of the Middle East. The people who left were not primarily the poor or the uneducated or the politically marginal. They were the doctors, the engineers, the architects, the professors, the film directors, the musicians, the lawyers, the exact people that 2 generations of the Shah's educational investment had produced. The university-educated urban middle class that had been, in many ways, the Shah's greatest achievement, fled the country that achievement had built. Los Angeles absorbed so many Iranian exiles that the San Fernando Valley neighborhood where they concentrated became known, half affectionately and half mournfully, as Tehran. By the mid-1980s, there were Iranian restaurants on every block, Persian-language radio stations, Iranian newspapers, Iranian grocery stores selling saffron and rosewater and dried limes, a complete reproduction of a lost world, maintained in Southern California sunshine by people who were always, in some part of themselves, waiting to go home. Paris absorbed another wave, then London, then Toronto. The diaspora was not simply a community of political exiles. It was an entire civilization in miniature, preserved in amber, sustained by memory and grief and the peculiar half-life of those who leave before they mean to. The women paid a particular price. The women who had marched in the revolution, who had believed they were helping to build something better than the Shah's authoritarian state, found themselves the first targets of the new order's consolidation. The compulsory hijab was only the beginning. The family protection law's repeal meant that women who had relied on its protections, who had used it to leave abusive marriages, to obtain custody of their children, to resist forced second marriages, found those protections gone. The minimum marriage age was lowered so drastically that it would take decades of incremental legal struggle to raise it again. Women who had held judicial positions were dismissed. Women who refused to veil faced arrest, fines, violence. The particular cruelty, and it must be named as cruelty, was that the women who suffered most from these policies were often the same women who had participated in the revolution. The feminist organizations that had marched against the Shah were among the first groups that Khomeini's consolidating government moved against. Women who had shouted death to the Shah found themselves, within a year, facing imprisonment for removing their headscarves in public. The revolution devoured its daughters with a specific efficiency that bordered on deliberate. By 1980, Tehran looked like the same city. The geography was identical: the wide boulevards, the mountains to the north, the ancient bazaar to the south. The buildings stood where they had always stood. The Alborz peaks still dominated the northern skyline, but the city had been gutted of the culture that had animated it. The streets that had been loud with music were quiet in the particular way of places where sound has been forbidden. The restaurants that had served wine had been replaced by establishments that served only what was permitted. The women who had walked unveiled had disappeared into either exile or compliance. The physical city remained. The city that had been alive inside it was gone. Walk through those streets in 1980. The cinema marquees are dark, or changed, or showing nothing at all. The bar where the jazz trumpet player had run his Miles Davis riff is shuttered, its windows dark, its door padlocked, a religious slogan painted on the wall beside it. The bookstore where the students had argued about Sartre is still there. But the window display has changed. The Sartre is gone. The mountains glow amber at sunset, exactly as they always have. They do not know what has happened below them. They have seen empires rise and empires fall, and they will see more of both before they are done. The city at their feet is quiet in the ways that matter, and loud in the ways that remain. The woman in the miniskirt is in Los Angeles now. She has an Iranian-American daughter who speaks English without an accent and has never been to Tehran. The daughter knows about Iran the way all diaspora children know about the old country, through food, through music played at family gatherings, through photographs, through a particular quality of sadness in her mother's voice when certain subjects come up. The jazz bar is a memory. The mountains are eternal. Everything in between is what was lost. Here's the question that haunts every honest examination of pre-revolutionary Iran. Was it actually good? The answer, honestly, is complicated. And the complication matters because if we collapse pre-revolutionary Iran into simple nostalgia, into a golden age of miniskirts and jazz bars that was destroyed by religious fanatics, we miss the deeper tragedy, which is more interesting and more disturbing than that. The Shah's Iran was a genuine dictatorship. Savak tortured people. Political prisoners were held for years without trial. The press was censored. Elections were theater. The Shah brooked no opposition, tolerated no independent political life, and used the full machinery of state violence to protect his power. The boom years of the 1970s built real things, real roads, real schools, real hospitals, but the wealth was distributed in ways that left millions of Iranians behind, and the political system had no mechanism by which those left behind could make their grievances heard. The revolution did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very specific, from the decades of accumulated anger of people who had been modernized economically while being denied any political agency, who had been told to be grateful for highways while being tortured in basement cells for asking for elections. The Shah built his own overthrow. He produced an educated, politically aware, increasingly frustrated population and gave it no democratic outlet. He guaranteed that when the dam broke, it would break with the force of everything that had been held back. This is the tragic paradox at the center of the story. The Shah's modernization was real. The Shah's repression was real. And the Shah's repression made the destruction of his modernization inevitable. He could not have it both ways. No one can. And yet, the road not taken haunts the story in ways that are impossible to fully let go of. What if the Shah, sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s, had done what South Korea and Taiwan eventually did, maintained economic modernization, while gradually, carefully opening the political system? What if SAVAK had been reformed, political parties permitted, free elections held? The educated middle class he had created would have had legitimate outlets for its ambitions. The clergy's network would have had to compete with real political institutions rather than being the only alternative. Khomeini's brand of revolutionary Islam would have faced genuine opposition from within Iranian society rather than being the only voice of dissent available. We cannot know. History does not run parallel experiments. But the generation of Iranians who lived through it, who attended those universities, who worked in those hospitals, who argued in those bookstores, who listened to that orchestra, who studied for that law degree, they live with the knowledge of what was possible because they lived in it. They know that the world that existed was real. They know it was imperfect. They know it was built on injustice. And they know, with a specificity that no history book can fully convey, exactly what was lost when it ended. 45 years later, the Islamic Republic has outlasted every prediction of its collapse. It has survived a devastating 8-year war with Iraq, waves of international sanctions, multiple rounds of mass protests, the death of Khomeini and the succession of his successors, and the continuous hemorrhage of its most educated and talented citizens to countries that will take them. It has proven durable in the way that authoritarian regimes sometimes prove durable, not through legitimacy, but through control. The generation that made the revolution is aging. The generation that inherited its consequences is protesting in the streets, as they have done repeatedly since 2009, with increasing courage and increasingly explicit demands. Young Iranian women remove their hijabs publicly, film themselves doing it, upload the videos, accept the risk. They are doing something that their grandmothers did without a second thought on the streets of 1970s Tehran. They are doing it as an act of revolution. That is the precise measurement of what was lost. Somewhere in Los Angeles, an Iranian woman in her 70s takes out a photograph she has carried for decades. It was taken in Tehran, 1975. She is in the photograph, young, laughing, in a sundress, standing on Valiasar Street under the plane trees. The mountains are visible in the background. She looks at it for a while. She puts it away. That world existed. It was real. It was imperfect, and it was beautiful, and it was destroyed in a single winter by forces that its own architecture had called into being. Centuries from now, historians will debate what Iran could have been, what it might have grown into, had the pressure cooker been ventilated rather than left to explode. They will argue about the Shah's culpability and the revolution's inevitability, and Khomeini's genius, and the CIA's interference, and the price of oil, and the weight of Islam, and 100 other variables that converge into the event we call 1979. But the Iranians who lived the before, who walked those streets, who studied in those universities, who listened to that orchestra, who watched the jazz bar on the corner serve its last drink on its last night, they do not need the historians. They already know. The Alborz Mountains still glow amber at sunset over Tehran. They are the only thing that has not changed.